So already a big welcome to everybody who's joining. I see still participants coming in. Because of the big number of participants, we're also working at the moment to connect to YouTube. So we're live streaming there as well. So we wait just a second for everybody to come in, and then we'll start with the GrazeLIFE event. So yeah, I see still people coming in. Perfect. Welcome this morning. So we'll slowly start while more people enter the room. To everybody who's already here, I want to say a good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Grazing for Life Symposium. This morning in the Grazing for Life Symposium, representatives from the GrazeLIFE consortium will present the outcomes and recommendations of GrazeLIFE. My name is Nelleke de Weert. I'm Communications Manager at Rewilding Europe. And this morning I'll be your host for this event. And I want to thank everyone who's listening to us today for joining us. A special welcome already goes out to Mr. Humberto Delgado Rosa, Director for Natural Capital at the European Commission, to whom later this morning, as a representative for the European Commission, we will hand over the GrazeLIFE results and recommendations. In a minute, Wouter Helmer, or Senior Rewilding Advisor at Rewilding Europe, and also the project manager of GrazeLIFE, will tell you more about GrazeLIFE itself. So the background of the project, the consortium, and also how research over the past years resulted in the recommendations we'll talk about today. So I will stick to informing you about the technical aspects of the program. The complete program will take about 2 hours and basically consists of 2 blocks. In the first part, Julia Rouet-Leduc and Dr. Guy Pear will tell you more about GrazeLIFE's results and recommendations. After those 2 presentations, we have then a few minutes for questions. In the second block, that's the block after the break, we'll step more into the field and we'll learn more about practical case studies in the Rhodope Mountains by Daisy Costa di Nova and Risto from Rewilding Rhodopes, and from Galicia in Spain, told by Dr. Jaime Fagundes. And again, after those 2 presentations, there's room for a few questions. We'll probably not be able to take on all questions. So I want to let you know already that at the end, we will let you know where to go with any burning questions you might still have left after the event, or also where to find them in the GrazeLIFE publications that will become available from today onwards. Questions can be put in the designated Q&A box. There's also a chat, but that's mostly for us to communicate to you. So any questions in the Q&A. But again, please remember, we'll only be able to answer them after each block of presentations, and we'll probably not be able to answer them all. In case you are experiencing any technical issues with Zoom, please note that simultaneously we are also live streaming this event on YouTube. There's, however, not a possibility to ask questions there as well. We focus on one platform. You can find the link in the chat box to the YouTube live stream as well in a minute. But please bear with us that we'll stay focused on the Zoom platform. So I hope in technical terms, everything is clear so far. Again, a warm welcome to those of you who are just tuning in. And then I would now like to give the floor or rather the screen, to Wouter Helmer as project manager of GrazeLIFE.
Okay. So I try to share screen now. Okay, thank you, Nelleke, and thank you all for taking the time to attend this online GrazeLIFE symposium. Before my colleagues will present the outcomes of GrazeLIFE, I would like to give you a short introduction on the background of the project. Maybe good to know that some 5 years ago, we found out that working in our rewilding areas, there were a lot of farmers, other land users willing to start with extensive grazing systems, beneficial for nature and man, but they were simply outcompeted by EU subsidized, more intensive form of agriculture. And that's what we brought up to the attention of the European Commission, and they decided actually to collect information about this topic via a live preparatory project. Well, that's actually what became GrazeLIFE. So you have to understand this is a project on request of the European Commission. And with the experience and knowledge we had that far, our assumption was that grazing systems could play a role in improved management regarding wildfire prevention, climate adaptation, biodiversity, and other ecosystem services. But we also started with the observation that current EU policies, legislation, and subsidies fall short in delivering these services. And in the end, we should come up with recommendations for improvement of those policies and regulations on several levels, European level, but also on the level of the member states. So that's the short where we started as GrazeLIFE Consortium, which is a team of about 13 partners, 11 on the regional level, with organizations in Spain, Lithuania, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Belgium, Netherlands, Portugal, Poland, Germany, and in Croatia, doing field work on the ground. We have a coordinating beneficiary on the scientific component, which is the University of Leipzig, and overall coordinating beneficiary is Rewilding Europe. This is the GrazeLIFE Consortium. Below right, you see a picture of the first and only time we met in physical in the Netherlands at that time. Of course, because the strange situation the last 2 years, we couldn't manage to repeat that. But anyway, this is how we worked. Important part of our work is case studies in the 8 regions I just mentioned, where we compare different management systems, grazing systems, and on topics like vegetation structure, biodiversity, carbon storage, and so on, which all resulted in 8 area reports that you also can find on our website. Apart from field work, we also involved a lot of people in our project. We organized in those 8 areas, in the end, 18 stakeholder meetings with more than 200 participants in 2 rounds, actually. The first round was to inform people, of course, about the GrazeLIFE project and to collect names of people who we could interview during the project. And the second round of stakeholder meetings was meant that what we did the last few months to inform people about the results of GrazeLIFE and to discuss with them follow-up actions we could do in the regions to implement GrazeLIFE recommendations. And then we have backed up the whole project with a scientific group. First, what we did, we found a person like Julia Rouet, she will present herself in a minute, who started a PhD study on the University of Leipzig, doing literature review and processing of all the interviews we did. And she was supervised by a team of 4 people, the scientific advisory board. You see the people in top right, specialists in European CAP policy, in grazing systems, in ecosystem services, and in wildfire prevention, which and these people also helped the regional teams to set up a clear methodology for their field work. And they helped us, all of us, to present the results already in a few scientific articles. Again, you can find them on our website as well. And as you understand, an important part of our work is policy related. We did an assessment of the current policies and regulations in Europe and how they support or frustrate grazing systems. We, oops, sorry. Something, yeah. Because of the ongoing CAP negotiations, we decided to accelerate the publication of that policy report. Again, you can find it on our GrazeLIFE website to have some impact on the current negotiations. And because we already in an early stage found out that not only on a European level, but especially on the member state level, a lot has to be improved regarding grazing systems, our regional teams already start in an early stage to contact the national and regional authorities to better implement grazing practices. So all in all, that resulted in 45 recommendations on cost-effective grazing systems toward EU and member states. Because these recommendations are quite technical, we also produced a layman's report. It's printed and you can ask for it in our office. That summarizes the main findings of the general public. And because in the end, of course, it's all about implementing these recommendations, we produced 11 practitioners' guides in 11 different languages for land managers to assist them with implementing these recommendations. All these reports, again, you can find on our website from here, where you can see the address, grazelife.eu. The documents are, as of today, available for all of you. And yeah, hope if your questions are not answered by our presentations today, you will find them in the reports on this website. That's it for now. Thank you and enjoy the symposium.
Thank you very much, Wouter, for this introduction. Then we will directly move on and now give the floor to Julia Rouet of the German Center for Integrated Biodiversity Research, EDIF. Welcome, Julia. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. My name is Julia. I'm a PhD student at IDIF, and today I'm going to talk about sustainable grazing for multiple ecosystem services and talk about the results of my PhD. So I'm going to give you a short introduction, then I will talk about some results from the literature review, especially focusing on wildfires and then on other ecosystem services. And then I will talk about some results from our interview analysis that we got from our case studies in GrazeLIFE. And I will talk shortly about our next steps beyond GrazeLIFE. So as Wouter said in his introduction, in GrazeLIFE, we are trying to look at different types of grazing and the different ecosystem services they provide in a European context, thanks to some case studies that are supposed to be representative of different types of climate and socioeconomic conditions. To do so, we used multiple methods, starting with a comprehensive literature review and also conducting some interviews and surveys. It's also interesting to mention that this was a highly transdisciplinary project where us scientists collaborated very closely with practitioners and even policymakers, even though it was unfortunately not as much as we had hoped because of the current situation. So the key hypothesis that we were working with was that we thought that sustainable grazing can provide multiple ecosystem services, and that currently financial incentives that influence decision on land management and subsidy systems are not fit for purpose, and also that wild and semi-wild grazing can be land management options that provide multiple ecosystem services. So to look at that, we used the framework of ecosystem services, which is nature's contribution to people. and we focus most specifically on some ecosystem services that we thought were most relevant. So we focused primarily on climate mitigation through soil organic carbon storage, but also biodiversity, habitat for species, cultural ecosystem services, and also moderation of extreme events, and especially wildfire prevention. Wildfire being a theme that was especially of interest to the European Commission from the start of the project, so we had a special emphasis on it. So to start with, I'm going to talk about some results from the literature review we conducted, started with the impact of grazing for wildfire prevention. So we published a study on the topic that came out very recently, where we looked at effect of large herbivore on fire regimes and wildfire mitigation, and we had a global scope, which could also inform us for the European context. So we looked at different types of animals and different types of grazing systems, and these are all the studies that we identified were relevant. And we can distinguish, as you can see on the map, that they were situated in different types of biome. So for example, in Europe, we can see that most of the studies were situated in Mediterranean systems. So some of the results that we found looking at all of these relevant studies is that large herbivores can usually contribute to reducing both wildfire intensity and frequency. As you can see, all studies combined mostly showed that large herbivores were able to reduce fire frequency or intensity. And we even looked at large herbivores' ability to reduce vegetation biomass and therefore fuel loads. But you can see on this figure on the right that it also depended a lot on their feeding habits. And we found that animals that were strict grazers, such as cattle, were not always able to reduce plant biomass. And this is usually due to the fact that they consume less shrubby and woody vegetation. Another thing that is interesting to mention is that mixed flocks composed of different types of herbivores were often identified as being effective in reducing fuel loads, especially when they had complementary feeding habits. So what we found as a conclusion was that large herbivores can be effective in mitigating impact of wildfires, mostly by reducing fuel loads in different types of ecosystem. But these results need, of course, to be nuanced because management with large herbivores is not always enough, and it can be used as complementary methods to other fuel reduction methods, such as controlled burning or mechanical clearing of vegetation. And it's also important to mention that some practices that are linked to large herbivore management actually causes more fire ignition that can lead to wildfires, such as burning for pasture renewal. But this study allowed us to highlight the importance of large herbivores as part of the solution for preventing and mitigating wildfires in Europe, and especially highlight the importance of some practices such as pastoralism. So in a broader review, we also looked at the impact of grazing on multiple ecosystem services, and that also allowed us to look at the trade-offs between different types of grazing and the ecosystem services they provide. And we often found that the effect of grazing is very different depending on the intensity of grazing. and we could identify some clear trade-offs between the different types of grazing management. So, for example, when you talk about biodiversity, we found that it could be negatively or positively impacted by grazing. So while some practices of extensive grazing and so on can promote biodiversity by creating a mosaic of grazed and ungrazed areas, promoting high heterogeneity at field and landscape level, intensive grazing was almost always having a negative impact on biodiversity, because then the animals graze unselectively and they create too high disturbance, causes problems of soil erosion, and also some management practices that are associated with intensive grazing, such as systematic deworming, is detrimental for biodiversity. Similarly, we found that grazing could impact negatively or positively the amount of soil organic carbon, and that by impacting soil compaction and creating changes in the nitrogen cycling, and that also once again depends on intensity of grazing. And we found that most often intensive grazing was creating a reduction of soil organic carbon. So as for wildfire prevention, I've already talked about it previously, but we also looked at cultural ecosystem services, and we found that most grazing systems can bring some cultural ecosystem services, especially traditional extensive systems or pastoral systems linked to very strong traditions, provided a lot of cultural ecosystem services, sense of place, and certain aesthetics, and could even contribute to other sources of income linked to agritourism, sales of local products, and so on. And even rewilding systems or systems with semi-wild herbivores could provide another type of aesthetics and a lot of opportunities for recreation, ecotourism, especially because of the presence of charismatic animals. But in some cases, these rewilding areas can also have a different sense of place, a more challenging aesthetic, especially if they are done on former agricultural land. So as a conclusion, it's very interesting to observe the trade-offs between the different ecosystem services that are provided by grazing in order to identify systems that are the best for multiple ecosystem services. So for example, when you talk about wildfire prevention, very intensive grazing would actually be the best for only wildfire prevention, because usually all of the vegetation is removed by the animals, but it's definitely detrimental for all of the other ecosystem services. So that's interesting to think about. So following this literature review, we analyzed the interviews that were gathered within the framework of the GrazeLIFE project in the 8 case studies that Wouter mentioned in his introduction. Just over 90 interviews were conducted with land users, farmers, and experts on grazing through semi-structured interviews and questionnaires. There was a focus on understanding their management practices and their decision-making drivers, their challenges, and their motivation for conducting their management practices. So as you can see on these pie charts, these are the actors, the participants that were interviewed, and this is the kind of management that they were conducting. So you can see there was a focus on semi-wild grazing systems and extensive livestock systems. The interviews were conducted by the GrazeLIFE partners in the local languages, and we then conducted a thematic analysis of the results. So we analyzed the results through the lens of the framework of the behavior change wheel, which is a framework that captures the factors that affect different behaviors and that then provides guidance for policy intervention. So the inner part of the wheel represents the behavior system, and then the type of intervention function, and then the type of policy intervention that is possible. My colleague Guy will later talk about the policy recommendation that emerged from these results. But as a starter, our interviews allowed us to identify key barriers and facilitators to the desired behaviors. And in this case, we focused on sustainable grazing practices. So I'm gonna walk you through some of our main and most interesting results that emerged from the interviews. So we identified some of the emerging themes in these interviews that were often common across different case studies and different participants in their main decision-making drivers to conduct sustainable grazing. So as a starters, one of the main type of decision-making driver was socioeconomic, and especially the impact of rural exodus, aging of population, lack of employment opportunities, lack of labor resources to conduct their management, and to finding qualified labor. Then a very recurring theme mentioned by a lot of participants is that they struggled with administrative burdens in conducting their activities. They often mentioned incoherent rules, and sometimes were struggling, especially when it was coming to the administrative burdens linked to subsidies, and sometimes lacking the knowledge to access the subsidies in the best way. Then one of the recurring theme that the participants mentioned was linked to environmental challenges, human-wildlife conflicts, and land use conflicts. So in a lot of cases, the areas where the participants are conducting their extensive semi-wild grazing activities are very remote. Maybe they have challenges with lack of resources, access to water, drought, and so on. And then there was land use conflict with neighboring activities that was mentioned a lot, and challenges related to control of animals, fencing, and so on. Then a very important element that was driving land users to make decisions was, of course, having a policy environment that is enabling or not to conduct their activities, and economic support. So a lot of participants found that there was a lack of incentivization for good practices related to sustainable grazing, and that there was not enough or not relevant economic support for sustainable practices, and often incentivization for the wrong practices. And in areas, especially that had a very strong link to traditional practices, we found that tradition was a very important motivation factor, decision-making driver for land users that wanted to continue conduct their traditional management that they had inherited from their families, even if sometimes they were not economically viable. And that was often the case in Galicia, Spain, as you will hear more about later, where people were conducting a lot their practices out of will to perpetuate tradition, even though it was not economically viable. And then finally, another aspect that was that we found often was driving decision-making for land users was wanting to do good management, caring for nature, and wanting to do management that is good for the environment. And they found often that it was not necessarily aligned with policy incentives, as I said earlier, and that often they felt like intensification was encouraged over caring for good management. So this was just a very brief overview of our key results. my colleague Guy will talk you through the main recommendations that emerged from these results in his presentation that comes just after. And you can find detailed results in the GrazeLIFE report that Wouter talked about. And just to mention that the next steps for me in my research beyond GrazeLIFE in my PhD is to try to answer what I found was one of the core questions in GrazeLIFE from the beginning, and is to try to map different grazing carrying capacities and optimal sustainable grazing densities in different parts of Europe, to try to look at indicators of biodiversity and ecosystem services to identify what are good grazing densities depending on the different areas of Europe. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on in the upcoming months, using all the knowledge and the expertise we gathered in the GrazeLIFE project so far. And with that, I want to thank you for listening and to thank my supervisors, colleagues, and partners of the GrazeLIFE project. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for this really clear introduction, in fact, background introduction to the many aspects of grazing. And you already touched on a lot of the subjects we will be talking as well on in the later presentations. I've already seen some questions coming in the Q&A box. Thanks for your active participation. But as said before, we will take on some questions. We will first move on to the next presentation. A colleague from Julia, Dr. Guy Peer, also representative of the German Center for Integrated Biodiversity Research, also working at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. Guy, the screen is yours. Please take over.
Okay, I had a technical problem to demute myself, so now I can speak. Everybody can hear me now?
Yes, you're clear.
And you should be able to see my screen now as well?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, thank you for participating, and thank you, Julia, for the excellent presentation of the scientific work that we've been doing together within this project. So we are all attending this presentation and event with the understanding that grazers are very important, that grasslands are extremely important for a variety of services to people and to nature, including biodiversity, climate, fire prevention, etc. The key question that already was brought by the presentation of Julia is that the question of challenges to the people involved in grazing and grazers management. We've identified through the interviews that took place within this project that there are a major set of different challenges to people that are engaged in this in such activities, starting with insufficient funding and support, including also acknowledgement by society. Many administrative burdens simply resulting from not understanding exactly what are the challenges to simply catch animals that are somewhere roaming around the place and mark them at the right time, and then they're facing sanctions that don't make complete sense to the system that they're working in. We have land use conflicts with other land uses, such as forestry expansion, as exemplified in Spain, for instance. But also economic competitiveness problems that emerge from the fact that obviously from an economic perspective, usually we are speaking about small farm holders or land users. If you have only one animal per hectare, then of course your income is much lower than a person who's holding 10 animals per hectare, etc. So there are a lot of issues resulting from market access and economic challenges. Also, for people working with wild animals, in the case of rewilding or other efforts for restoration, there are simply the problems that many animals are rare or even excluded by national legislation to prevent, for instance, damages in forests. And we came to the conclusion this is counterproductive, for instance, for fire prevention. But the most common attribute to the interviews that were conducted and to basically the input that we got from people that the most important mechanism affecting the decision-making of people engaged in farmers and other land users engaged in grazing is the common agricultural policy, being the key policy mechanism affecting farmers in general and grasslands as well. Now, we all know a lot about the CAP, but just to make sure that we all have an equal background of understanding where we are standing. Obviously, there are mechanisms within the Common Agricultural Policy as the biggest policy instrument of the EU, with 55 billion euros a year, more or less. There are already instruments to support, so to say, green activities or activities in favor of nature, including, of course, payment for areas of nature constraints, Natura 2000, organic farming, and the most important one, of course, agri-environment and climate measures. We also have the greening that was established in 2014 and immediately abolished in the current CAP reform. And we have cross-compliance, a set of standards that farmers have to comply with if they want to receive money within the CAP. I guess all of you attending this event or listening to this presentation are aware that the CAP has two pillars. One, which is taking the largest bulk of money, is pillar one, with direct payments being the most important instrument. And these divide between coupled and decoupled payments. And we need to recall that coupled payments have been defined as a harmful subsidy because basically in most cases they're coupled with intensive farming, especially in the case of grazing. And within pillar two, of course, this is where agri-environment climate measures reside. But we need to remember also the objectives of the CAP and the problems with it. Generally, the new CAP will have 9 objectives, and they are also coherent to a certain extent with the current CAP. But there are major disbalances between the efforts placed with the largest effort into what you call income support or supporting competitiveness. And we all know that there are conflicts that emerge from these payments with nature aspects. But I want to highlight here the social aspects, actually, or the socioeconomic aspects resulting from hectare-related payments or investment in competitiveness, which results actually in exclusion of small farmers or weaker farmers. And in fact, lack of instruments to support some issues that everybody agrees that is really important. For instance, like improving the position of farmers and land users in the value chain in order to make sure that they make a fair share of the profit. This is extremely important because it affects especially small farmers and small farm holders. And in the case of extensive grazing, we're talking, even if the area is large, about economically weaker activities. Economic viability is part of sustainability, and we are seeing that small farmers continue to decline throughout Europe, with particular losses of small farmers in Eastern Europe. These are the colors that you see with the size of different farms in Europe, and we see that within only 8 years, from 2005 to 13, we've lost about 2.2 million farmers in Eastern Europe alone. So the green right side is the bigger farmers, and these are the only ones that have been increasing. And this is consistent throughout Europe. This is not to say that the CAP has been the cause of that, but it hasn't succeeded in halting these losses. Now, we all know that there has been now a CAP reform with 3.5 years of intense efforts to improve the CAP and to address some of the challenges, including the environmental ones. So probably many of you are already familiar with the graph that you are seeing. On one side, we see the current CAP with the green instruments of what we call the green architecture. So the agri-environment climate measures, which will be retained, but with a budget cut towards the next CAP period of 2023 to 2027. We have the canceling of greening, instead enhanced conditionality. And we have a new instrument, eco schemes, which is obligatory for the member states to provide, but voluntary for farmers to take up. And so we have 2 voluntary mechanisms to support farmers and land users in doing the right thing from an environmental perspective. Now, we should not forget that there are many other instruments within the CAP that could potentially be supporting activities of grazing and grassland management if they are used appropriately. And just to mention a few, payments for areas facing nature constraints have not been used equally in different member states. In some, they've been used quite effectively. In some, they're actually harmful subsidies. The same goes for non-productive investments, which are a very important instrument for restoration, and knowledge support, which could be used by well-trained ecological consultants, for instance, and farm advisory services if they are well-trained themselves, and if they support with the knowledge and evidence that exists. Now, the main question is now, are we going towards an improvement, and how can we make sure that we use all these set of tools in an effective way in the next CAP? And to answer this question, I will take the recommendations not only from GrazeLIFE report, and which we published in March, and from the recommendations that were harvested within this project, but also additional processes which took place within the project ICAP-BES of IDIV, where we've activated over 300 scientists in 22 member states through workshops and an online survey, as well as processes within Germany, but as part of an initiative in 10 member states, led by the environmental agency of Austria within the BirdLife Birds in Farmlands initiative, a tender by DG Envy and DG Agri. Now, here are key recommendations that emerged. First of all, we need to make sure that the definitions are right. And here we could say the definitions from grasslands should be expanded to make sure that habitats under the habitat directives and areas that we know that animals are grazing in, especially scrubland, reed, wood pastures, are being covered. And in this sense, this has improved to a certain extent in the new CAP, but there's still room for improvements, especially to make sure that high nature value farmlands are covered. And this is now for the member states to do. For enhanced conditionality, maybe I simply skip this part of the presentation because evidently the science and the policymaking did not match each other for political reasons. This is something to regret, and here I can only mention the fierce efforts done by the Commission to try to retain some dignity for European organizations and institutions in fighting for evidence-based policy. Unfortunately, this has not been the case in the watering down of basic standards which are necessary. For instance, in mentioning grassland quality and not just grassland area, or in making sure that landscape elements are preserved in all places where they're necessary for the own good of future production. Areas, agri-environment climate measures are the most important instrument and likely will remain the most important instrument to support grazing, grasslands, etc. But we need to make sure that the budgets are sufficient, that they have enough flexibility in the smart way of flexibility to allow adaptation to local needs so that we don't just set dates and people have to do things in a very specific way, but we engage consultants and experts to make sure that we do the right thing in the right place. And there are some types of agri-environment climate measures which are very effective, and particularly if they're done in this way of allowing some freedom for smart implementation. Especially when we're talking about grazers that are moving over large areas, we need to make sure that we're working on the landscape level. And in here, collective implementation is extremely powerful. And allowing some result-based implementation, again, in the case of grasslands, this is extremely valuable because it allows empowerment and effective use of the knowledge that the people in the field actually have. And they know how to produce the results that we need to make sure that we support nature, climate, and people. But this would require giving more mandate for consultants and other experts in supporting decision-making, in mediating between administrative issues and the knowledge and needs of the farmers and other land users in the field. And this is currently not happening in the current CAP. This means that, especially in the next CAP, we need to see how we reduce administrative burdens for people working, especially in difficult landscapes or under economically difficult situations, and to reduce hurdles that result from lack of recognition for an obvious situation like wolf attacks, which we know are happening in many situations. The other thing that came up in many of the interviews was the need for greater support of what we call organic farming. There has been also a paper from Thea Chandke and others criticizing organic farming definitions, especially of the EU, for being very narrow-minded and not really taking into consideration what sustainability is. So the definition of organic does not include pastoralism. It doesn't include Obviously, sustainable management of extensive grazers that might go and feed on conventional fields, and then they're no longer organic in this sense. So we may need an organic plus label and certification process, which will make it a bit easier for small herders to participate, to make sure that they're not excluded simply because of over complex definitions which don't actually fit to what we know from the science is sustainability. Direct payments are taking the largest share of the budget, about 70%, and this will actually increase in the next CAP. This means that we need to make sure that we support what works and stop supporting what doesn't work. Coupled payments in particular should either be used for extensive farming, for extensive grazing, for pastoralism, and they could be used for such aims. But if they're not, then I think it's time to phase them out, as proposed also by the World Trade Organization before. Areas of nature constraints need to be clarified. It's a very vague instrument which is being used by the member states for whatever purpose they want to use. In the next CAP, it's going to see only 50% of recognition from the EU, but we don't know what that actually means. The easier and smarter way to make sure that member states are using it for clearly defined targets, especially the environmental targets, if areas of nature constraints are listed within the environmental envelope of the CAP. And last but not least here, make greater use of the knowledge support system, ACIS, the leader approach, and farm advisory services, and make sure that they support ecological needs. This brings me to the final instrument, and the one that is currently under the most intensive discussions, of course, eco schemes. Eco schemes are a new instrument. We don't know how it's going to actually work and whether it's going to create a major change into the CAP and to the environmental poor status, especially of grasslands in Europe. But scientists, through the processes also of engagement across Europe, were giving clear recommendations how to make sure that they really work and how to make sure that they double, if not more than double, the budget for a good implementation. And that means that they need to be evidence-based for what really works and avoiding what doesn't work. And we know very well what doesn't work from the current CAP, especially if you include productive measures. They need to invest in non-productive areas, landscape features beyond conditionality, given that conditionality has been watered down. Extensive grassland needs to be supported in a smart way that would allow extensification or retention of extensive landscapes. And we need to see that it will help restoration. An important issue in eco schemes, of course, is that they need to be attractive and simple, but also they need to be continuous over time. We know that the ecological benefits are increasing over time when you invest, especially in extensification of grasslands. And here are actually the risk in eco schemes. Their annual design, because of annual contracts, is a problem. And the potential dilution by using them for other purposes is still a problem. And that brings me to the reality of the trialogue negotiations, which as a scientist I've been observing with great concern and seeing a polarized debate as if farmers and society are divided from each other, whereas in reality, we do know that farmers, especially the majority of farmers in Europe, are actually quite pro-environment and they're asking legitimately to be supported by the CAP and by society in doing a better management. So this division between farmers and society doesn't really exist in reality. And we see a lot of misinformation, misrepresentation, and processes that have led to a watering down of the CAP from a scientific perspective and also as a citizen unnecessarily. This brings me to the final part of my talk where I want to see where we are now. So the final CAP agreement has been reached, and in an initial evaluation of what we have, conditionality has been only slightly enhanced. Unfortunately, definitely not to the extent it needs to be enhanced. Eco schemes do offer an opportunity, but it still depends on the member states on what they actually will do with that. Agri-environment measures have seen a reduced budget, and we need to see that member states are increasing it back through the flexibility that they have to shift money from Pillar 1 to 2. But we still have also harmful subsidies, which are still retained in the CAP, and some of them even expanded by, for instance, support for biofuels. So overall, it seems that the changes of the CAP in their, so to say, reform or actually slight change, is definitely not sufficient to the size of the climate and biodiversity crisis that we are facing and the risks that we're facing for the future of farming in Europe. And that means that at the moment we are in a situation where the decentralization to the member states puts a lot of power for them to be ambitious and to do better, but we know that the majority of member states are not ambitious. And this is a great risk to achieving any great improvements in there. There are some good news also in the sense that there's more power for the Commission through, for instance, Article 92 in checking the ambition of the member states. But the devil here is in the details. And as an example, we are currently evaluating within the birds and farmland project, we are evaluating the eco schemes that were proposed by Germany. And the list is quite long, so I'll just paint them in different colors to the positive and negative effects that we found. Grasslands is very dominant in there, and this is quite positive given the benefits. But in great extent, we are only supporting existing extensive grasslands rather than real extensification. And we even have limitations or even investments that could be counterproductive in some cases. So there are some risks that eco schemes will be used primarily to support what was not achieved through conditionality. And this was also the same messages that emerged from a recent study published last week by WWF, EEB, and BirdLife, where they evaluated eco schemes from throughout Europe, and they came to the same conclusion that the minority of the eco schemes are really going to be beneficial. And here we have a set of tasks ahead of us to try to improve in the coming months what is submitted by the member states and evaluated by the Commission. In order to finish here, I want to put some final recommendations for implementation. First, there's a big task for the Commission to accompany the decision-making and to make sure that the national strategic plans are improved according to a set of clear criteria, such as following evidence and the criteria that I gave before. Even more so, there are big tasks ahead of the member states to make sure that they really achieve an improvement compared to the current CAP and aligning with the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy. And they will need to invest in more knowledge support to make sure that they really achieve the purposes. They will also need to be more transparent with how they're using taxpayers' money in order to make sure that everybody agrees and accepts the way that the current big budget is being used. Now, it's also time to move on and to agree that we need to look forward and think what to improve in the near future. First of all, putting more emphasis into the interactions with member states, with administration, etc. Looking very carefully into the national strategic plans, but also thinking, how should the CAP look like after 2027? There's clear problem with transiting the CAP into a better direction. And that means that probably we have to simply phase out completely direct payments and find a better way to support farmers towards what they need, especially for areas which are taken out of production. A fund for nature will be critical. For Natura 2000, it doesn't make sense to be dependent on CAP payments, but rather on an independent funding mechanism. We need to focus more on national legislation, and we need to improve the labeling and certification also in order to move forward towards the consumer side to make sure that both the production and the consumption are smart and accompanying both the needs of nature and people. With that, I think what we need is basically a food policy and a farm to fork policy rather than just a strategy in order to make sure that the Green Deal is green and that is being successful for the benefits of everybody. With that, I'd like to thank you. It's also time to thank a large number of people who have been contributing to this work and to thank, of course, the team of GrazeLIFE for their great work and very interesting project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guy, for your very insightful presentation, taking us further into all the aspects of the current legislation and also the recommendations now that follow from the thorough analysis of these rules and regulations. We're a few minutes behind schedule, but still good to give room to a few questions. We can just take on a few. Like said, at the end, we will let you know where to go if you have any burning questions left. Just first, a few questions for Julia. I think one very good one to start with is how did you distinguish between intensive and extensive grazing? What specific measures or where's the difference?
So I think, and that's what we found very early on in the literature review, that the definition of what is intensive, extensive varies a lot depending on the conditions, how the animals are managed, the plant productivity, and so on. So when we looked at intensive and extensive, we just went by what the study said, because often when we looked at studies that were comparing levels of soil organic carbon or impact on biodiversity, they were having different grazing regimes that they were comparing, and one of them was extensive, intensive, and no grazing. So we just went by what the study was saying, and that was varying a lot depending on where the studies were conducted. And I guess that was also the case in our case studies, where extensive and intensive grazing looked differently depending on where you were looking at.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Another question for you, asked during your presentation. If you can explain a little bit more why intensive livestock grazing does reduce the soil organic carbon.
Yeah, of course. So grazing creates changes has an impact on the soil in general in different manners. So it changes the input from plant biomass and the litter production on the soil, and it affects respiratory processes of the soil and affects the amount of soil erosion. And through these changes, it can also affect soil compaction and create patches of bare soil that impacts soil organic carbon loss. And then in some cases also because of the grazing process, because animals are going to graze plant biomass over the ground, it can have consequences on the root structure of the plants, affecting also the soil organic carbon in the soil then.
Thank you, Julia. There are a few more questions left for you, I guess, here, but I move on to Guy now as well, because we also have some questions for you. One of the first ones that was asked during your presentation is, why are eco schemes in Pillar 1 if they are voluntary?
Well, the idea of eco schemes is to green Pillar 1, and this is the same idea of greening before. So if we want to retain the payments in Pillar 1 and support farmers in terms of income support, but at the same time, there's a public demand and an agreement that we need to make sure that they do the right thing from an environmental perspective, then the idea is to improve greening and to take it into a different direction. And the experience from greening was that compulsory measures see a lot of resistance. People do not accept them for a range of reasons, partly because they don't want to be forced to do that. And therefore, a different approach was adopted, saying we want to allow farmers that go the extra mile, as they call it, to receive higher payments for doing that. But indeed, there's a lot of question of whether it needs to be in Pillar 1 and 2. And these are, to a great extent, more political questions rather than ecological questions. That's why, as scientists, our job in this sense is to find the right way of making sure that the different mechanisms operate together and complement each other.
Well, then in addition, I have another question for you. I've seen that multiple people touched upon that subject, ranging somewhere between a political question and ecological question, I guess, and much about the extent of the GrazeLIFE project, namely if the animal health regulation was also taken into account as a challenge for grazing practitioners. And how do you see the animal health regulation as a possible challenge for extensive grazing?
Maybe here to explain a little bit the process, the interviews that were conducted with the farmers and other land users were bottom up in the sense of allowing them to express what are the challenges that occur. And then we took all the interviews and evaluated which are the different policy mechanisms that are being mentioned and are major challenges. And indeed, health regulations were extremely central as well. Some of them are taking place through the CAP, some of them through other mechanisms like national legislation. And so I did not mention them here, but I'm sure that Wouter will also talk about them in his final presentation. Some of them had to do, for instance, with over complex definitions for marking animals, vaccinations for animals that don't necessarily need them, or deworming agents that are overly used or required actually, and very complex mechanisms that make the life of people working with grazers very, very difficult, especially for the semi-wild animals. So yes, we have touched upon that, and we gave a long list of recommendations, for instance, on ear tagging and basically giving more flexibility and making sure that people don't get sanctions in places where it doesn't make sense, but rather that there's a stronger interaction to meet the needs and where it's not necessary, for instance, as well. So veterinary regulations definitely are very central there.
Clear. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Julia, both for your presentations and answering these questions. We do know that there are more questions in the Q&A, but we do have to move on considering time. Because at this point, we also would like to hand over the recommendations resulting from the GrazeLIFE study to the European Commission. So, Wouter, if you want to take over from here again, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Nelleke. Mr. Humberto Delgado Rosa, dear Roberto, I see you're online. First, I really want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to find out what grazing practices serve best European goals on biodiversity, climate adaptation, and also targets of the European Green Deal. Well, as you understand, we had to work under very difficult circumstances. As I already mentioned to people, we only saw each other one time during the project, the rest all was online. But still, I think the consortium, the GrazeLIFE consortium, did a great job. And thanks to all partners in the consortium, I think we really could provide you with high quality advice. And actually even more, we also formulated dozens of recommendations for the people on the ground to implement best practices. So I hope that you share those conclusions, and even more that you succeed in converting these recommendations into improved policies and regulations. So thanks again, and good luck with the follow-up of these recommendations.
Well, thank you, Wouter. Yes, we are very pleased with the results and recommendations. And on thanking you, let me say that these results and GrazeLIFE itself touches me also personally, because to share a bit of elements of the origin a bit, I'm Portuguese, and in 2017, more than 100 people were burned in forest fires in my country. That had a big impact. And of course, the national debate that followed, first conclusion, we cannot sort out mega fires by fire suppression, by airplanes and firefighters, whatever you put there, it's not enough in those special circumstances. The second debate, how to do forest fire prevention. And of course, one element is prescribed fire. But other people would claim we would need machinery and humans taking out biomass and putting it to use. And they say, well, good luck about that. And the territory is just too vast. So there was one element there, which is this ecosystem service of managing the biomass through grazing. And that's a bit the origin of this life preparatory project that you've taken up so efficiently and that you now deliver to us. Because indeed, you know, on this issue of the mega fires, some elements were well identified already. If you have more than 30 degrees centigrade, a wind of more than 30 kilometers per hour, and less than 30% humidity, the 30-30-30, you're doomed. But on top of this, if you have more than 10 tons per hectare of accumulated biomass, bye-bye, it will torch. So, and we've seen that also in other countries in this summer, for instance. So does grazing provide an ecosystem service for forest fire prevention? You answer very clearly, yes, several forms of grazing. But more than that, you've also shown there are other co-benefits, other ecosystem services that link to several of the objectives of the Green Deal. So we are indeed very happy to have these arguments to show that the extensive systems do help manage the landscape towards making it more resilient and more diverse. I also see here, of course, a link with the wider question of rural abandonment, or if we direct the appropriate investments, so it should bring in extensive approaches that can make it socioeconomically viable, that will be an extra plus to get. So indeed, I think we have shown what is a true nature-based solution, this buzzword coming in for biodiversity and climate purposes, which are often cost-effective with social co-benefits also, and certainly not without many of the drawbacks that are known from intensive systems. Now, you also identify that's much useful, and the presentations you heard, including the presentation of Guy on the CAP, show some of those challenges. Does the CAP stand in the way? Does the animal health regulation stand in the way? Well, this needs to be addressed, of course, and we can always look to the glasses half empty or half full. I've, of course, followed all the debate in terms of shaping the new CAP. As Guy said, it is out there. It still offers some opportunities. The eco schemes are one of them. Yes, they are voluntary for farmers, but if properly designed by the member states, they can be very attractive for farmers and still deliver for biodiversity and climate. Will the member states follow that option or not? Well, the debate is out there. Where we cannot expect a revolution, a sudden revolution. So at this stage, there's a role for the Commission for sure, and we will fulfill it. But there's also a role for society to engage in discussions with the ministries of agriculture, the ministries of environment, bringing in the information, because on several of these options, it makes social and economical sense. So let's be patient and go towards that. Maybe I would end on sharing a bit of a little story. You know, I've also seen in the chat of the questions some reference to wolves. And actually, the wolves are expanding in several areas in Europe. So I've done some visits to areas where there are conflicts with wolves, one of which was in Spain. And in Spain, I've seen areas where, say, it was relatively easy to invest to protect the sheep. And so you just need some fences plus some watching over. That would be relatively easy to tackle. But I've seen a case where, well, the youngest of the shepherds was 65. They used to bring the cows up the hill and leave them during the day and return later in the evening and bring the cows down. Of course, when wolves come, that's a problem because the wolves will go for the easiest prey. So what's the solution there? Fencing the mountain, bringing in more shepherds? So there are areas where the viability will probably what you would call some semi-wild, maybe, with more resilient cows that can stand for themselves and defend themselves, or some rewilding in some cases. So my message is, there's room for everything in Europe. There's room for intensive livestock farming, which should become more sustainable in itself as far as possible. There's room for extensive livestock farming, for pastoralism, for semi-wild and for wild animals to come back. But we certainly need this restoration, this re-establishing natural process in landscapes, as I've seen in the chat, and grazers are certainly part of the puzzle. So thanks a lot. We will do the most with results of this project. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you, Humberto. And don't forget to spread the message. So the printed report is available for everyone who's attending this seminar. So please, spread the message. Thank you.
We will. Thank you.
Thank you, Wouter, and thank you, Humberto, as well. The report Wouter just showed, I believe Guy just placed the link to the publications in the chat as well. Publications will be available from today onwards. They're already present on the GrazeLIFE website, grazelife.com, also on the Rewilding Europe website under publications. And to summarize the first part actually of this event in a visual way and make the bridge to the second practical part, we have a video as well that I think neatly ties it all together. We want to show that to you now. So I will start sharing my screen this moment, and I hope you enjoy.
Long before the first humans arrived, large grazing animals roamed the continent of Europe. Species such as aurochs, wild horse, European bison and deer all had their own unique impact on the landscape. Through this interaction, they played a critical role in the lives of myriad other wildlife species. Over time, agricultural land use grew, and grazing was merely seen as an agricultural practice. As intensive livestock grazing increased, So large wild grazers disappeared from the land. But, as we learn today, the landscape still remembers. Today, Europe is facing major environmental challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, soil degradation, and an increasing risk of wildfire call for urgent action. At the request of the European Commission, Rewilding Europe and its partners in the GrazeLIFE consortium looked at how grazing could help to address these challenges. Over the past 3 years, a team of experts conducted case studies, literature reviews, and numerous interviews with stakeholders. These helped the team generate recommendations for both policymakers and practitioners, and offer a hopeful perspective for the future. But changes are urgently needed.
So the extensive GrazeLIFE study resulted in 45 practical recommendations for policymakers and practitioners. Some of the most important ones relate to Europe's Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, which is the single most important factor influencing grazing and herbivore management in Europe. But unfortunately, at this moment, the CAP mainly favors intensive land use, leading to biodiversity loss, social and health costs, and serious environmental impact.
It all starts with the realization that large grazers in low, natural numbers can help our ecosystems thrive. This extensive grazing provides many public goods and is beneficial for both nature and people. It could even help to realize 13 out of the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Extensive grazing supports rural economies, especially in areas with production difficulties. It helps to restore vegetation mosaics with high levels of biodiversity, contributing to attractive and healthy landscapes, clean waters and soils, and enhancing carbon storage in soil and vegetation. And by opening up the vegetation, large grazers also help to reduce the risk of wildfire, especially in Mediterranean areas. But despite all these benefits, current policy and practice are failing to provide enough support for extensive grazing.
So considering the wide range of benefits of extensive grazing, at least the CAP should create a level playing field for extensive grazing compared to more intensive subsidized land use models. But even if we manage to do that, there will still be obstacles, mainly on the national level, because most of the member states still fail to take advantage of existing rules on the European level for extensive grazing, or even worse, they impose additional conditions which really frustrate the practice of extensive grazing.
We therefore need more alignment in support at European and national levels. Member states, in particular, need to adopt broader definitions of grasslands that include wood pastures and other grazed habitats to render them eligible for CAP subsidies. The same goes for permanent grasslands, wetlands and forests. Land users lose the right to subsidies when flooding occurs, while in some countries, grazing in forests is still prohibited. It's clear this has to change. Subsidies must become more flexible in order to benefit people and nature as much as possible. Moving from policy to practice, we recommend landowners and herd managers work with primitive, sturdy, local breeds that are accustomed to living in feral or wild conditions. And it's not only the breed that matters, but also the social structure of the herd. Social herds are preferred from an animal welfare point of view, but they also use landscapes in a different way and enhance biodiversity on a greater scale. Such herds are also better able to defend themselves against predators, with younger animals learning from older ones. Countries should take advantage of the possibility offered by the European Animal Health Regulation to create a special category for more or less free-roaming herds of domestic livestock, which takes into proper account the natural, social behaviour of these herds. To further support biodiversity, the use of deworming medicines in herds occupying natural areas should be stopped. Healthy dung without deworming medicines is a rich source of biodiversity. But deworming medicines harm biodiversity, as well as the capacity of dung beetles to transport organic materials, and thereby carbon into the soil. Carcasses of large herbivores are a rich source of biodiversity as well, with hundreds of species participating in the so-called circle of life. EU regulations allow farmers to leave carcasses in the field following a veterinarian check, but only a few countries take advantage of this possibility. For the sake of biodiversity, we ask all member states to leave carcasses in the field wherever possible. These are just a few of the recommendations. It is clear that greater support for extensive grazing should be prioritised in European policy relating to agriculture, climate, food, and environmental issues. With some small but essential changes to laws and regulations at a European and member state level, this can be realised. Large grazers have always been critical to the functioning of healthy, biodiverse ecosystems. It is also clear that they play a crucial role in wildfire prevention, carbon storage, and other public goods. It's time to restore their place in the landscape. Right now, we need them more than ever.
And with that message, we'd like to end the first part of this event. It's now time for a short break. We want to continue the event 5 to 12. We're a little behind schedule, so that's in about 8 minutes. So hope to see you back then for the second part, in which we will step more into the field and talk about the practical challenges. So welcome back, everyone. It's 5 to 12, and I want to welcome you to the second part of this GrazeLIFE symposium. In this second part, we will talk more about the grazing challenges in practice. For those of you who are just tuning in or missed the first part or have to leave for the second part, I again want to let you know that the whole symposium of this morning will be available on our YouTube channel, the YouTube channel of Rewilding Europe, later today, as well as the video we just showed before the break. So you can rewatch it or share it with those you think that might be interested as well. In terms of presentations, we will first start with learning from pioneering practice in the Rhodope Mountains. So I want to invite Daisy Kostadinova and Risto Ristov from our Rewilding Rhodopes team to take the floor, or take over the screen, better said, and tell us about grazing practice in the Rhodope Mountains.
Hi everybody, I am Desi, and next to me is my colleague Christo, and we are from Rhodope Mountain. So we will show you our results in the GrazeLIFE project. Oops. Sorry, but I have some technical problem. Check. It's working. So Rhodope Mountain, located in the southwest corner of Europe, just on the border with Bulgaria and Greece, in a really very south part of Bulgaria. And it's very typical with its mosaic landscape. You see one beautiful picture from our area, which is very representative for it. All this mosaic landscape, of course, has huge variety in species and habitats, and maybe one of the most important characteristics for the area are preserved natural processes such as natural grazing, predation, and scavenging. So you see part of small pieces of our biodiversity. Important part also are the scavengers like vultures and predators like wolf. We hope soon we will have also bear. On natural grazing, we work a lot for restoration of wild herbivores. So you see the bisons and wild horses that manage our landscapes, also red and fallow deer. But important part of in natural grazing also play the local rare breeds, which are still preserved and present in the area. This is Rhodope, Shorthorn, and Bulgarian grey cattle, Karakajan sheep, and horses. Why they're so important? First, because of course they're unique genetic resource, but they're also very well adapted to local conditions. So the people breed them, from millenniums, and they're well adapted to the climate changes also. And usually the people breed them in social herds, which are very important in the area with predators. So within GrazeLIFE project, we make analysis of the most representative land use practices and the challenges and advantages of the land use practices in the area. We focus on 3 study areas, and we have 8 case studies in these areas. So we collect different information about land use, property type, animal density, type and number of livestock, and etc. Additionally, we make also research on biodiversity using this tool biodiversity data quadrat, collecting data from the official sources, and we make also several transects to verify this data on the field. So we collect good information about the birds, amphibians, reptiles, and mammals present in the study areas. One of the most important things was, of course, the interviews. We make 10 interviews with landowners, NGO, and representatives, governmental representatives. Additionally, during our field work, we speak a lot with the local people about their problems and all other things that they face regarding the livestock breeding and in general in other things connected with grazing in the area. And stakeholder meetings, it was very important. We managed to make 2 stakeholder meetings with representatives from farmers, local institutions, governmental institutions also. So we managed to collect really a lot of information and also a lot of advices. And so our main outcome is that still in Eastern Rhodope, there is traditional livestock breeding, which is very close actually to natural grazing. And all this traditional livestock breeding is based on the knowledge and understanding of natural processes. Usually the people who practice this, they keep this knowledge that maybe come from millenniums, but it is really very nice to see how these people really understand the nature and its processes. Other thing is that traditionally the people prefer to have social herds with very strong social organization, which are really good, can prevent themselves from the predators. Most of the people prefer to breed local rare breeds because they are sustainable, they have less diseases. Traditionally, the animals are all year round, outside grazing, without fences. The density is very low, and the animals make natural food migration from lower part of the mountain to the higher to follow the grass and the water also. And of course, all these animals are part of this natural food chain, because if some animal die in the mountain, thanks to the vouchers, they actually immediately disappeared. And other characteristic is that these animals actually produce food, but with low or with no or without use of artificial food, and also veterinarian medicines are not so much used when they practice this kind of livestock breeding. Of course, these people have a lot of challenges, and I will present you part of this. One of it is actually the cap requirements for the landscapes. You see one natural landscape and one cap landscape where all the bushes are cutted. And actually this is the big problem also for the people in the area, because they understand very well that actually the natural habitats, natural landscapes also means food all year round for the animals. And if they have to cut because of the subsidies, the bushes and even sometimes mow the grass, they actually remove the natural food for their animals, and they have to buy and bring food from other areas. And actually it is ununderstandable for people in the area, if the Europe want to get green and to decrease the carbon, etc., why they have to cut all these bushes if still their animals can eat them. Other very big problem is forest grazing. In Bulgaria still it is some legal regulations that not allowed actually the grazing without shepherds in the forest. Also night grazing is not allowed. And additionally, last year there were new orders for Natura 2000 areas, and it is especially for Rhodope Mountain, for Eastern Rhodope, there is official ban for grazing in all forests. You already see from the presentation and from the movie how important is grazing in the forest, in the especially in the Mediterranean region, where we have where we might expect big wildfires. And also during the summer, in the dry season, the forest is actually the main source for food for animals. Additionally, there is, of course, legal requirements for the farms, which, according to the law in Bulgaria, for every farm should have good stable or shed for animals, even if they're all year round outside. Additionally, the pastures should be fenced, so no other grazers can go and graze on the same pasture. Also, livestock must always be grazed by the shepherd, and there are additional restrictions for mixed farms. So it is not possible to have in one farm, for example, horses and cattle. For each species, the farmer should make additional farm with additional stables, with additional pastures, which should be fenced and etc. And additionally, there's very complicated procedure and requirement for direct sales from the farm. So actually, the people who practice the traditional livestock breeding in Eastern Rhodope, first they're pressed because of the legal requirements to change their practice and to make it more and more intensive. And second, if they don't do that and continue their traditional way of livestock breeding, which is very natural friendly, actually they have no access to subsidies and of course to the market. Additional problem is of course the legal requirements for animal welfare. So they're absolutely not applicable for traditional livestock breeding because they require big farms with wide air condition, space for each animals and etc. But actually, if the animals are grazed like they do since centuries in Eastern Rhodope, they don't need houses and they just need grass and open place. But because in the law, there's very strict requirements for this, actually a lot of these people pay a lot of penalties or have other problems just because they don't follow the strict rules. Additionally, actually, when we put all the animals in the farms, it means that we make a very good condition for spreading of diseases, which in case of traditional livestock breeding is not possible first because usually when the animals are bred in social herds, the herd reject the sick animals, and of course the predators and scavengers do the rest of their job and stop spreading of diseases. But unfortunately, the legal requirements want animals in the farm with more veterinarian treatment and etc. Other problem that is very, very typical for the area and for Bulgaria is actually that the law somehow cannot understand why the people want to breed their animals till very long age. For example, this cow that you see, the name is Albena. She died, I think, in 28 or 30 years, when she was 28 or 30 years old. And the farmer kept it till the end because she was the leader of the social group, the oldest cow. She know where the water, where the good grass, how to prevent themselves from the predators and etc. But still, for example, the new strategic plan in Bulgaria proposed a limit for support of animals which are older than 10 years old. And it is really very bad for the people and for the animals, of course. Sorry. Another problem that the people face is the controls and the inspections. So it is really very bad because all these animals are free. In summer, they go to summer migration, so high in the mountain, far away from the farms. But actually, exactly in the summer, the institution in Bulgaria decided that they have to check and control the animals. So the farmer should collect and close the animals for at least between 4 and 8, sometimes 10 times per year. And as a result, it is really very bad for animals, a lot of stress and suffering. We have maybe 2 months ago, a call from one of the farmers who should collect his horse herds. And because they're separated in 2 social groups, 2 harems, he and the veterinarian asked him to collect the both harem in one fenced area. The result was, of course, fight between both stallions, and one of the females was hurt and killed during this fight. So sometimes it even can cause the death of the animals. other very big problem for the people is bureaucracy. Maybe like all countries from East Europe, we have very, very big bureaucratical requirements, and it is really very bad for the farmers because they spend a lot of time traveling between different institutions to collect needed papers, to collect different kind of permission and etc. Actually, we discussed with the farmers and they complain that actually their main carbon footprint is traveling between the different institutions. And Bulgaria tried to do something to make it more easier, to make it online and etc. But unfortunately, still it doesn't work. Human-human conflict is also very it's also a result of the subsidy policy in Bulgaria, because actually, if you want to get more subsidy, you must have more animals. So increasing of number of livestock usually has as a result conflict for pastures and water. Of course, there are, on one plot there are different using rights, and this actually is again caused conflicts. But maybe one of the most important problem between humans is actually conflict between shepherds and hunters, and very often they killed shepherd dogs because of this conflict. And actually the shepherd dogs are one of main complaint from the people who practice this traditional livestock breeding in Bulgaria. On the pictures, you see Karakachan dogs. They're very typical for this area, and they're actually selected for centuries for predator protection. This breed has absolutely no, how to say, hunting instinct, but they only protect the livestock. But in Bulgaria, they have this horrible obligation to wear this stick that really hurts them, and they cannot run. And additionally, they cannot do their job to be effective protection against the predators. And additionally, if the dogs don't wear this stick, there are cases when the hunters kill the dogs, and you see two of these dogs, Boyko and Karavash, which are killed actually by hunters just because they don't wear this stick. Of course, human-wildlife conflict, we have wolves in the area, and we think in very good density. And in general, average 10% of the livestock and also of the population of wild animals every year killed by predators or died by diseases. And for livestock breeding, actually presence of wolf is very big problem, because if the animal is killed by a wolf, they have to pay penalty, or there is decreasing of subsidies for this missing or killed animal. And of course, as a result, the people started to search for another decisions of this problem, and usually it is a poison. Several years ago, we have very big poisoning accident. And the good thing that there were no voucher poison, but it's maybe question of time. That's why it's very important to find a decision for all this. Additionally, there is no working system for compensation from damages from wolf and jackals, which are in Bulgaria actually hunting species, because they have to pay by the owner of hunting rights, and of course this is not working. And even if there is some kind of compensation for wolf damages, usually in the practice, they're paid after it can be proven that actually the animal was killed by a wolf. And in our area, unfortunately, it is not possible, because we have vouchers, and usually the vouchers find the killed animal before the commission that should tell that this is actually wolf killed. So, in general, the traditional livestock breeding in Eastern Rhodope really benefits the nature and the people, and it supports the rich biodiversity, but also it keeps the people in the area. But to protect it, and we need really legal support on European and national level, not only to promote and to support it, but also to have different rules and different legislation for this kind of livestock breeding. Otherwise, we see already the process of how to say, of more intensive land abandonment, and more people skip their traditional livestock breeding and just move to the big towns. Additionally, we the people really ask to decrease the bureaucracy. It is too much. On one hand, it is good because when the people are so busy with bureaucracy, the animals get more and more wild because the owners have no time to take care of them. But it's still too much. And also, they really need a legal change to allow grazing in the forest, of course, in low density. But it will really help to keep for fire prevention and also for biodiversity. Another very big problem that we face is actually that the people in general, the general public, don't understand the ecological role of grazing and this need of social acceptance and support. And I really hope the results from GrazeLIFE will help for this. And what actually the local farmers ask is to have a separate subsidy with different rules for the traditional livestock breeding in Eastern Rhodope. Maybe it will be applicable also for other areas in the Europe. I really hope. But if we have local specific, I believe that we have to respect them and to support them, and maybe one separate subsidy will really help for that. And I think this is all.
Well, thank you, Daisy, for this insightful presentation. Yeah, there's nothing like practical examples to give more insight into the actual grazing practices, but also the obstacles that practitioners encounter in practice. But also, thank you for taking us to the wonderful Rhodope Mountains. I think many of us, after seeing this presentation with some beautiful pictures, would really like to visit the beautiful landscape. But from the Rhodope Mountains, we will now travel to another part of Europe, northwestern Spain, Galicia. So I will like to give the screen to Dr. Jaime Fagundes from the University of A Coruña, who will tell more about wild ponies in Galicia.
Thank you. Well, hello everybody. I'm Jaime Fagundes from the University of A Coruña in Spain. And yes, I will try to show you a little bit of this very special system of the wild ponies and why we believe they are the true guardians of the mountains in Galicia. So this is Galicia. It's an autonomous region in the northwest of Spain. Galicia mainly relies on its first sector activities, including fisheries and agriculture, farming and forestry. But just like many other regions in Europe, we're facing an agrarian depopulation process, which takes place mainly in the mountain areas where the people used to live on natural resources, which are no longer in use. Take, for example, gorse, this thorny, woody legume, which once was a very useful resource from the mountains of Galicia, used to be collected and mixed with cattle feces, would create manure for improving the productivity of the family orchards. Abandoning these practices means that the gorse encroaches in the mountains and this poses a threat because this is a very pyrophytic species, and there is increases the risk of wildfires in these areas. But also gorse is an important part of the diet of the main character here, which are the wild ponies of Galicia. So the wild ponies occur in the mountains of northern and western Galicia. They are ranged in bands, and they live on their own in the traditional way. They are only gathered once a year by the local pony owners in what is a festivity for them, and in some places it has even become an important touristic attraction. But for the rest of the year, the ponies free roam in the mountains, and they have to deal with difficult conditions, harsh climate, nutrient poor diet, and the permanent threat of the wolves, because in Galicia there is one of the European areas with higher densities of wolves. So there are no official numbers, but from what we know, the population of wild ponies in Galicia is declining, and so are some of the habitats which are used by these ponies, mainly open habitats with very high natural values, like the wet heathlands, which are recognized by the European Union as a priority habitat. And this has been changing towards other land uses. The main one probably forestry with species with low natural values like eucalyptus. So in the context of GrazeLIFE, we evaluated the situation of the wild ponies in two different areas, in Xistral up in the north and in Aroba, south near the city of Vigo. The two areas have a much different situation in terms of climate and dominant vegetation, and also some socioeconomic constraints. So in each of these areas, we identified what we call the natural grazing semi-wild model, represented by these heathlands that are used by the wild ponies, and compared to other alternative land uses, such as long-term afforestation, represented by pine forests. Short-term afforestation are the eucalyptus plantations, and extensive grazing, which is represented by improved pastures dedicated mainly to cattle grazing. And then we also identified abandonment areas where the shrubs have turned into scrub, almost impenetrable, where there are no longer ponies. So we perform our field work in these areas. We had our specific design to gather data and focused on three items, which are biodiversity, carbon storage, and wildfire risk. So for the first one, biodiversity, we use the proxy of species, plant species diversity. And so we found the highest values in the heathlands used by ponies, especially in Xistral, to your right, where numbers were much higher. But more important, some of the rare species, the less frequent species, were only found in these plots and not in other alternative models. So the second parameter that we were interested in, which was carbon storage, we measured two compartments of carbon. One of them is the aerial biomass, for which we cut vegetation in plots and weighed and tried them, and we also calculated tree density and measured tree girth to apply standard tables to estimate carbon storage. And the second compartment, which is the soil stored, the carbon stored in the soil. For that, we took soil samples and measured organic matter, which we used as a proxy for carbon. So combining both estimates, we found that the main compartment is the carbon stored in the soil compared to aerial biomass and vegetation, either for shrub or even for trees. In the case of Chistral, to your right, we clearly found the highest values in the natural grazing semi-wild model, which are the wet heaths. And for Grova, to your left, we found that the difference were not that clear. So our values were similar to some in other systems, and the higher values were found for long-term afforestation. So third, for wildfire risk, we created this index by taking into account the regional constraints for the difference between Chistral and Grova, which I mentioned, and also the vegetation condition in terms of shrub covers and what were the dominant species, and also considering the inflammability of each of these species. So from this combined index, we concluded that the natural grazing semi-wild have a low wildfire risk for Chistral and a medium value for Grova. And in Grova, we found the highest values, especially in the abandonment plot, followed by the short-term afforestation with eucalyptus. So the second part of our work in the project was to conduct several interviews and stakeholders meetings, which were very useful to understand better the system and also to know about different challenges and what are the demands of pony owners. We interviewed pony owners, but also other stakeholders related, like landowners, including commoners from commonland. So some of the things we learned is that they mostly use ponies to follow a family or community tradition. So this means that they actually don't get much profit from these activities, and they find some other incentives which are more related to, in a way, the sense of community that they get from this activity, especially for the festivity that represents the drift that they perform once a year. But they also value some of the benefits of having ponies in the mountains, because these ponies, they keep the vegetation in an optimum state. So they improve the pasture for cattle, and cattle, it does provide more profits to the farmers. They also value the fact that ponies control gores, and that reduces the risk of wildfires, and they are much aware of that. But then there are several issues related to the ponies. Some of them are the compensations for wolf attacks and the difficulties they have to asking for them. Some administrative boundary burdens, like those related to identification through microchipping, and the permanent pressure from other sectors which claim the land, mainly the forestry sector, and then some problems related to the common agricultural policies, and that clearly penalizes this this type of land exploitation. So as conclusions, we found that the ponies have a very relevant ecological role in the mountains of Galicia, especially for rare species and habitats conservation. They also provide good values for climate change mitigation through carbon storage, mainly in the soil, and they are very important for preventing wildfires. We found that there is a strong cultural connection of the local communities with these ponies that they own, and that there are other benefits, clear benefits from this presence of the wild ponies, like the improvement of the woody pastures for cattle grazing and the avoidance of shrub encroachment. So from the main issues that we identified, we would like to make some recommendations, specific recommendations in this case for our area. We have compiled that in our area report, which will be soon published and open access publication through the University of A Coruña Publication Service. So one of the main issues would be the lack of profitability of this activity. So we recommend to find other alternative schemes for supporting the pony owners and maintaining the ponies in the mountains. And we also claim that the ponies should be included in the forestry management plans, that it's actually the most important legal document for management of the land in these areas, and also to diversify and promote and support other uses, which would include wildlife tourism and actually the touristic attraction of the wild ponies, which is quite high. So the second issue, as I mentioned, has to do with the common agricultural policies, subsidies, the payments, and ponies are clearly penalized. There are several issues there, and some of them Guy have told us about. Especially in this case, I would mention the coefficient of admissibility of woody pastures, which get lower payments, although the ponies are animals which not only graze but also browse the gorse, so they are using that resources. And the second important thing is the livestock unit counts, which for ponies is the same as for cows, and this should definitely change. We would recommend a lower count for ponies. So the third issue is the wolf attacks. which is quite high for ponies. And here we would recommend different scheme for paying for these attacks, which would not need to inspect the carcasses in the field, which is very problematic for the owners, but rather payment scheme for mares, for having the mares in the mountains where we know there is a high wolf population. There's gonna be attacks, and so payment can be done ahead before that takes place. The fourth main issue is about the administrative burdens. One of them related to the European regulation of equids identification, which we would suggest to use the derogation that it's admitted in this regulation for some specific areas. And the second one has to do with the problem of traffic conflicts. There could be better signaling and also some fencing in some specific roads where there's common problems. So these suggestions would apply for several areas, which can be identified at those mountain ranges in Galicia where there's still a traditional management of the wild ponies, and they could have specific forest management plans, which would include the specificities of each of these areas. And there we could apply specific measures from the common agricultural policies, the positive payment schemes that we propose for wolf attacks, the derogation for horse identification, and some planning to reduce conflicts, which would deal with limiting the impact of forestry and leaving these areas for the grazing of the wild ponies. So thank you very much. I would like first to say thank you to my team of researchers who have done an excellent job in this project. Thanks also to our university for the support. Thanks to Rewilding Europe for inviting us to the project, and all other partners. And very special thanks for the pony owners. Muitas gracias a todos os besteiros de Galicia, o noso reconhecimento. Thank you everyone for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jaime, for this presentation. At the beginning, you showed us how challenging the habitat can be for the ponies in Galicia. So it must be a challenging habitat for research as well. So I think we could say tough job, well done. We quickly move on to just a few questions before we have to move to the final stage of the event. To Jaime, is there any report about these specific studies in Galicia? Will they publish separately from GrazeLIFE?
Yes, there is. Well, all our results will be published. The specific area report from Galicia will be available in a couple of weeks, and there is also some scientific literature. Not as much as we would like to have, but yes, there's some. If anyone is interested, can email me, and I can send everything that has been done so far regards the wild ponies of Galicia.
Thank you. Also, a question for you. If the gorse has become more abundant or widespread as the number of ponies has declined, can you say anything about that? Do the ponies actually control and reduce the dominance of the gorse?
Yes, definitely. Well, there are two issues, because gorse was commonly used by people as well. It's part of the diet of the ponies, but it was also collected by people. So the first practice have been quite abandoned. People doesn't go to the mountain and collect gores there. So there's only the ponies left, and the ponies are declining through the region. So both things are applied, and gorse's encroachment is everywhere. It's a problem.
Thank you for these clear answers. There was one more question for Daisy, but I see Guy already answered it in the chat because I think it's a very valuable question to repeat as well. I will quickly mention it. It was a question to the team of the Rhodopes as to why farmers do have to cut shrubs and mow grass to comply with the CAP policies. Guy already gave an answer here, I see. Thank you, Guy. That's because of the grassland definitions in the CAP and accordingly the eligibility criteria. So this means to be eligible for CAP subsidies, farmers need to have open grassland. So that's exactly why in the GrazeLIFE recommendations, it's said that the definitions of grassland need to be expanded. Thank you, Guy, for this answer as well. With that, I want to close off the Q&A session here. It's been short, but considering time, we have to move on. As mentioned in the beginning, if there are any burning questions left, please direct them at the end of this event to our project manager of GrazeLIFE, Wouter Helmer. His email address just appeared in the chat. So yeah, let him know if you have any burning questions, and Wouter will make sure it gets to the right people. And then I now also would like to give the floor again to Wouter for the final stage of this event. Yeah, to show us where to go from here.
Thank you, Nelleke. Yes, we are running a little bit out of time. I will try to do my presentation a little bit faster than originally planned. But yes, as you understood, we come up with, based on the results in Rhodopes, in Galicia, in the 6 other GrazeLIFE areas, and with the literature review, we come up with 45 recommendations. There are only a few, but very important ones on the European level. But as most of you actually are working on national or regional levels, and where we see the biggest challenges, I want to focus my last presentation on that level and give you all, suggestions to work on the coming years. As we see, most member states fail to take advantage from already existing EU policies, or they even obstruct implementation of extensive grazing systems that could be already possible within the current EU legislation. I've listed the most important ones below. I split it in 3 categories. Those where we have to push for national authorities to change their regulations. A second category is actually to, within the existing regulations, to negotiate for better practices. And the final one actually is to support herd managers to improve their practice with the knowledge and experience we gained with GrazeLIFE. So starting with the category push for changes, it was already mentioned, we have an animal health regulation at the moment. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I understood my screen is not visible.
Walter, I can share the screen.
Yeah, no, sorry. Sorry. Can you see it now?
No.
Sorry.
Yes, it's visible now.
Yeah.
Yeah, just put it
Sorry, guys.
Great. Working
Okay.
now.
Sorry, going back to. So as we already, as some of you already mentioned, there's a new animal health regulation in working now since this year. And actually it makes it very difficult for extensive grazing practitioners to comply with that regulation. But also this regulation offers some derogations where we should push the national authorities to make use of these derogations. And one of them is to withdraw free roaming herds of water buffalo, cattle, horses, and of course bison from this animal health regulation. It's possible within the current regulation, countries should do it. And the same counts for large extensively grazed areas. You can register them for relaxation of microchipping horses or ear tagging of calves. So these are possibilities within the current animal health regulations, but if you don't apply them in your country, you really have problems as an extensive herd manager to comply with this, this regulation. The other one, also mentioned during the presentations, and maybe one of the most important ones, is actually that there is a possibility within the European law to subsidize a broad range of vegetations, but on national level, most of them are not applied. And this is the case for periodically flooded grazing areas, for reed and rush vegetations, for grassland under bracken, but also for scattered scrubs and wood pastures. So here again, push your national authorities to make these vegetations eligible as well. And here in the worst case scenario, when you are forced by your national authorities to act against Natura 2000 or the Water Framework Directive, you even can take them to court to improve the situation. Of course, it's not something you want to do, and therefore we also recommend to establish teams of national experts actually that can judge if subsidy systems are counterproductive towards each other. So, and the idea is then that by involving them in judgment of conflicts, to give binding advices in a way that in the end the subsidy offers the best for public goods. And you can also imagine that these kind of national teams, national experts, can help to give shepherds, farmers in remote areas access to these subsidy systems, because most of them at the moment are just not aware of their possibilities. Another thing related to the wildfire thing, we should better support grazing fire brigades, for example, by specific subsidies. Now you have subsidies for mechanical cleaning, with adding, with supporting grazing fire brigades, as we call them. We could lower those costs and instead set up a broader system that also benefits biodiversity and carbon storage in the long term. By creating strategic natural water sources, we also can spread the grazing effects of these herds over the vulnerable forest areas, like we have to do in some parts, for example, of Croatia and Portugal. And very important, allow extensive livestock in forests, of course, in those areas that are vulnerable for fires. Some of these countries still have a law which doesn't allow grazing animals to enter the forest, which is, of course, again, counterproductive to the prevention of wildfires. Then hunting regulations, especially in those cases where herd managers work with wild or semi-wild grazers, it's important that they have the power to allow or disallow hunting in favor of the best grazing model. And in general, and that's also something we experience from some rewilding areas, increasing wildlife numbers helps to distract predators from livestock. So you can organize that together with their hunting associations. Then, already mentioned by Chaim, support horse grazing in a way that horses are considered as smaller livestock units, so to say, than cattle, to lower the pressure to replace them by cattle. And Chaim already mentioned the advantages of that, but it's also another aspect of that is that you also reduce methane emissions, as horses emit 3 to 4 times less than cattle. So having horses in the grazing system also is beneficial from that perspective. And the last thing where we should push for changes is the circle of life topic. At the moment, only 8 countries in Europe make use of this EU regulations to leave carcasses of livestock out in the field. We should push countries where this is not the case to do the same. And after veterinary check, actually, you can also avoid that the risk of spreading diseases by these carcasses. And then you should actually it should be possible to leave carcasses out in the field on those places where it's not, where actually it doesn't harm anything. Then negotiating for better practices within existing regulations is, for example, when it comes to slaughterhouses. It's when we lower the threshold for operating mobile slaughterhouses in remote areas, we significantly lower the cost for people working in those areas to bring animals on long distances to the official slaughterhouses. So this is another tool that could improve grazing practices in remote areas. Another thing, allow year-round grazing. So skip the obligation to build shelters for sturdy breeds. They don't need it. It's just a cost for people who manage these herds, and there's no need at all for it. But you can imagine that on a national level, you provide them a list of suitable breeds for year-round grazing, which in many cases overlap with those primitive rare breeds that we want to protect for other reasons as well. Sorry. Then another thing related to animal welfare, allow shooting in the field of injured animals. Don't give them the stress of rounding them up and transport them on long distances to the slaughterhouse if you allow local managers to shoot the animals in the field. And another thing, what Daisy already mentioned, synchronize the timing of veterinary controls with seasonal migration patterns. Don't ask farmers to control their animals in summer down in the valley, while the animals at that time had to be up in the mountains on the summer meadows. That just frustrates these kind of seasonal migration patterns. All these things are still not aligned in many national policies. And then the specific one, cross-border grazing, as most countries have still different rules on grazing. You have sometimes the case, like here in the border mews area between Belgium and the Netherlands, that animals take the risk that when they cross the border, that they start to become illegal for whatever reason. So in these cases, it's really important that bordering countries, at least for these areas, make the same rules for animals in large transboundary grazing areas. Then last category, improve grazing practices by herd managers themselves. You can think about organizing regional training programs on best practices using our practitioners' guides. As I already said, we have 11 guides available now. You can use in your country as well. And you can imagine that in the future, with those national expert teams, we expand the impact of that by organizing trainings with them as well. Then I will go very fast through this. If possible, use suitable breeds that are really well adapted to natural circumstances, that can calve foal without human assistance, that are adapted to local climate conditions, that know how to get the best nutrition from the natural vegetation, hardiness against disease, and so on, and that are able to fend off predators. Again, this is of course especially for semi-wild, wild grazing activities in remote parts of Europe. This makes life really easier compared to, for example, grazing with sheep or goats, which is more difficult to prevent from predation. Also important, use social herds. As you already understood from the presentations we heard, it's animals pass their knowledge to next generations, the knowledge about how to find the best feeding places during the year, how to avoid floodings, and so on. The animals know it, they build their own cultural knowledge about that, and they should be able to pass that through next generations. How to protect against predators, they learn. And if you know that, it's also important to understand when you have to regulate numbers of animals, that you pick out not just some animals or one animal, but that you always look to the social structure of the animals and take out, if needed, social groups. So a complete harem or a group of young bulls, and not disturb the social structure when intervening in the herd structure. Then use mixed herds, of course, because they create more diverse landscapes with different strategies that facilitate each other's with their feeding patterns. So really, in some places, horses facilitate cows, for example, by eating gorse, like in Galicia. And the other way, you also see the other way around, cattle facilitating horse by breaking up long grasses vegetation into shorter grass vegetation. And very important, like we learned more and more from especially areas in Croatia and Bulgaria, that different species help each other to defend against predators. Cattle defending horses, even wild animals against predators. And the last recommendation is about these medicines that are still used everywhere in Europe. Imagine 80% of our interviewees mentioned that they still use deworming medicines, and not knowing about the destructive impact of these. So we really should stop using this, at least in nature areas. That's it. I hope you enjoyed the symposium. I can imagine that if we haven't been able to answer your questions today, hopefully you will find it in the reports that are now available. You can find them on this website. And as Nelleke already said, I will try to answer all the open questions that are still in the Q&A the coming weeks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Wouter, for this final roundup with very clear recommendations where to go from now. That's, of course, what GrazeLIFE was about, coming up with some clear recommendations, both for policymakers and for practitioners, to make the change we urgently need to allow for more extensive grazing to benefit both people and wildlife. As Wouter already mentioned, please send an email to Wouter if you have any burning questions left. His email address is already in the chat box. Or take a look at the GrazeLIFE reports, of course, both available on the GrazeLIFE website, grazelife.com/publications. Where you find both the detailed recommendation report, but also the practical guides for practitioners. They're also available on the Rewilding Europe website. And also the presentations within this recording of the event will become available on our YouTube channel, as well as the video we showed just before the break will also become available on the YouTube channel of Rewilding Europe. Links are now also again in the chat box for those who want to read more. Again, thanks to all the speakers for enlightening us today with your research results and giving us all this information. And I want to thank all the participants for joining us this morning. We were really happy you be here, and together we hopefully can make the changes that are needed and push for some change. Wouter, again, thank you. Speakers, thank you. And we hope you will join us next time for our next event. Goodbye.